Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are dialing in from. Afternoon here in Singapore, very good morning to Europe. Welcome to our webinar, RSIS webinar, A Pacific Turn, the Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union toward Asia. The European Union foreign ministers and leaders will very soon, in the next week or two, agree on a EU Indo-Pacific strategy. This follows national guidelines, among others, by Germany and France on the Indo-Pacific. I have here in the region encountered more questions in the past year or so about Europe's engagement in this region than I have in the previous 10. So there is clearly some movement. This follows those guidelines. This follows a general greater interest by the European Union by European states and the European Union as an organization in this region. There is so clearly a realization in Europe that the Indo-Pacific matters somehow. I'm pretty sure they don't know exactly yet how it matters, but it does matter. And there is a realization here in this region that Europe somehow matters, right? It's not just the Americans and the Chinese and the Japanese and other local resident powers. It somehow is also the European Union, not least reflected by, of course, military exercises and port visits, and of course, massive economic and social connectivity between the two regions. So we had a webinar a few months ago where our guest speaker today was one of the 4 panelists, and he then only had 10 minutes, and his presentation in 10 minutes, it was very interesting, but it felt like there's so much more to be said, so much more detail we could go into. So we felt it really deserves a full webinar on its own merit. So we have somebody here who is probably one of the best placed people in the world to explain to us how can we conceptualize the European Union as a foreign policy actor in the first place, and once we've done this, how we can think of what can we expect of the European Union as an organization to bring to the table here. His main argument will be that it is very likely that we will see more Europe in this region, but that does not necessarily translate into more European power here in this region. This is a conundrum that I'm very pleased to discuss today with Christian Rieck. He is an assistant professor at the chair of war studies at the University of Potsdam in Germany, and he's a senior analyst at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels, and he teaches comparative regionalism and international relations in Berlin, Strasbourg, and Madrid. So you tell me one more full, complete European than Christian Rieck, and I will be impressed. So thank you very much for your time this morning, Christian. We are very, very honored to have you on board once more. He will speak for about 20, 25, 30, something like this minutes, and then we will go into the Q&A before we finish in about an hour or so from now. Please, our audience, make active use of the chat and Q&A function, and I will now hand over to Christian. Thank you very much for being here.
Yes, thank you, Frederick, for this invitation. Good morning from Berlin. My hypothesis today, as Frederick rightly said, is that we'll see more Europe in Asia and the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, but we'll not see more European power. Right? So I call this, or I would say rephrase this in a way that we will see a pivot to Asia in Europe, but not, sorry, a turn to Asia, but not a pivot to Asia. Right? So you could also call this a Pacific turn. And this is really difficult to understand if you're not, say, from Europe, because you believe, well, if there's a political decision taken, right, to increase the European footprint in Asia, then this will translate immediately into more European power. Right? But of course, this is not the case. And this is due to, say, the structure of the European Union. It's a very specific regional organization. So I would encourage you to ask questions afterwards if like this is too complex or I'm talking too fast, right? I'm happy to explain how the European Union works. And this is really important to understand because European defense is a function of the alignment of member state interests. right? And this is because the structure in the EU is in permanent tension between two principles. One is called supranationalism and the other is called intergovernmentalism, right? So if the EU Commission says one thing, right, it creates an Asia-Pacific or an Indo-Pacific strategy, right? This doesn't mean that it immediately translates into more European, say, boots on the ground, in inverted commas. But let me share my screen and then I can explain better what I mean. All right, if you can see the slide. All right, so I call this a Pacific turn, the foreign and security policy of the European Union towards Asia. And EU interests in the Indo-Pacific broadly mirror those of its member states, right? So the EU being the EU Commission, or say the EU as a level of governance, a supranational level of governance above the member states, right? So but the ideas basically are the same: multilateralism, climate and environmental security, economic interdependence, and regional security. And you can see here that the EU focuses on these more civilian aspects of foreign relations, say. And again, this is a result of the EU structure that because, and that's an important hypothesis, the defense capabilities lie predominantly on the member state level, right? This means that the EU doesn't have its own sovereign autonomous capabilities to change the political calculation on the ground in the Indo-Pacific. Right? So when we talk about deterring China or hedging against China, right? This will mostly happen through funding and through, say, soft power initiatives in the EU. And the reason being that the capabilities, the defense capabilities, the hard power capabilities lie with the member states. And this explains why a country like France has become very visible in your region. It's because it has the ability to project its power autonomously into that region, something that the EU lacks. All right, so a Pacific turn, but not a pivot to Asia. Member states and the European Commission have pushed for an upgrade of their relationship with the Indo-Pacific, especially with ASEAN, Australia, and Japan. And this is interesting because both levels of government have done this, right? It's the member states and the Commission, and this has happened in parallel. It's not the member states, say, pushing the Commission to do this. It's not the Commission trying to convince the member states to do this. So there's a broad consensus in Europe on all levels of governments that Asia matters and it will continue to matter, and that China has now become something like a systemic competitor. But at the same time, of course, we need cooperation with China to deal with, say, the hard issues like, say, climate change and others. Right, but the focus has been on ASEAN, Australia, and Japan, so-called like-minded countries. In foreign policy, especially in trade and security cooperation, the importance of the Indo-Pacific will continue to increase. However, competing regional priorities and strategic cultures among the member states, right? So they're all not the same. We're not all France, right? And I'll explain this better afterwards in a few minutes. Competing regional priorities and strategic cultures among the member states, especially in defense, make a full-blown pivot to Asia unlikely, if not impossible. Right? Because even if France decides to increase its footprint in the region, right, this will not be enough, right, to achieve all these lofty aims, like deterring China or hedging against China. The EU will not gain autonomous defense capabilities because this could be the easy way out, you could think, right? So why not supranationalize defense, right? And this will sort of increase European power in the region, but this will not happen because of the specificities of the European integration project. And it will also not become a unified foreign policy actor. So I'm sorry to disappoint here, but this I thought I sort of put the hypothesis out there in the beginning. Right. So this is really interesting, and it's striking, right? That I say, oh, well, it's going to be more Europe, but not more European power, because we have a commission that calls itself a geopolitical commission and is the most ambitious commission in foreign and security policy in the past few decades, right? It likes to compare itself with the Delors administration or the Delors Commission in the 1980s. After a long period of European stagnation, that was very active and rejuvenated or reinvigorated the European project. I think this is the mental map that they have, but here now it's in foreign relations, not so much in the single European market, or the common European market. And so that's very interesting. And the people, you know, we're talking about Josep Borrell. He's Mr. Gasp, as this title, as this this office was called in the past. He's something like the European foreign minister. He has, we call it a double hat, so he has two jobs at the same time. He's the high representative of the member states, say of the Council in Europe, but he's also the vice president of the Commission. Right? So you can see here that foreign relations sort of the stuck in between a supranational level, right? So the Commission is a supranational institution, and the member states, right? Because the member states are still very much in the driver's seat here. So this would be the intergovernmental element, and this is why he's a high representative of the Council, and the Council is the representation of member states' interests. So, and then the solution was to give him both jobs, right? To unify the two jobs in one person and make this office sort of hybrid, right, between supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. Josep Borrell, he's the Spanish diplomat. And then, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, she's the Commission president. And I mean, COVID-19 now has changed the foreign policy agenda, and it has distracted the geopolitical commission from geopolitics and geoeconomics. So that is also true. And we've seen that there's, say, a big disappointment or a lot of frustration in Brussels because the Commission had other plans, especially in international relations. But, and this is important to understand, no matter how activist a Commission is in foreign relations, due to the heavy reliance on member states' capabilities in defense, but also in foreign relations, right? Say Europe without the member states is not as powerful internationally as we might think, you know, despite the Brussels effect and all these other regulatory things that we usually read about. There's always, say, an inbuilt expectations capabilities gap when we talk about the European Commission, and even more so if the Commission is so ambitious, right, as in this case. And this Commission has been in power for 2 years, and it has not been able to sort of jumpstart either European defense, even though there has been a lot of change and movement in that policy area over the past few years. And also in international affairs, Europe is not seen as being, say, more powerful than before, right? So I think the Geopolitical Commission, I think this was, it was a bit too ambitious to think about, say, creating a new Europe in the world, right? Despite, say, important strategic documents like the global strategy, right, that mirror this geopolitical ambition that Europe has. All right, so drivers and constraints towards a common approach towards the Indo-Pacific, right? I said that member states and the Commission are broadly in unison, right? When we think about the Asia-Pacific, and you can find this in the European global strategy too, even though there's a strong emphasis here on civilian elements and soft power elements. But the biggest constraints, of course, are competing regional priorities, right? And the most important one being Russia. Of course, some EU member states are focused exclusively on Russia due to, say, geographic proximity, and they feel threatened by an assertive Russia that has already shown its muscle in Ukraine, right? But also Germany is like fixated more, of course, on the more immediate, say, threat in inverted commas, so challenge, and that is Russia. But of course, that means that we lose sight of the challenge behind the challenge, the more systemic global challenge that is China, and that's of course something that we need to remedy. So this is why the specific turn is so important. So this hints a little bit at the relationship between the Union and the member states. And I'll go through this really quickly because I want to focus on something else. The member states, of course, are not, they're very different, right? So there's no consensus between member states. And this is because political systems are different, self-perceptions are different, right? Take Gaullist France versus, say, transatlanticist Germany. And of course, the ability to project power around the world is also very different. So of course, then, and this is the slide about France, this is a slide about Germany, we see this very different understandings of, say, or self-perceptions of what should be the role in the world of these countries. countries. And of course, if you don't have that kind of consensus between the member states, right, then of course, you have no chance of the EU Commission to sort of being able to really enhance nation state power, right? Because there's also no consensus on what the role of the EU Commission or the EU should be in that particular policy field. And in defense, this is really particularly striking that it doesn't, that doesn't really work. So this is Europe's approach towards the Indo-Pacific. This is from a blog post by Josep Borrell, by the foreign minister, the European foreign minister. So what is this about? And Frederick said rightly that we still don't have a strategy, but we're getting there. But the basic ideas are already here. So it's about rebalancing relations with China. It's now seen as a partner, competitor, and rival, so all things at the same time. So we need to mix competition and cooperation. But at the same time, we need to scale up relations with the rest of Asia, and this is really to allow for hedging, right? So that especially India and like-minded partners should be offered geopolitical and geo-economic alternatives to Chinese influence without forcing countries to choose, however, right? So this is not the Cold War. And then there's, of course, this more lofty ideal of upholding rules-based orders multilaterally, but also in the region. This explains why ASEAN has now become a strategic partner of the EU, because it is seen by the EU Commission, but also by, I'd say, most of the member states as being a force for good in the region, because it has brought some level of stability and rules-based order to Southeast Asia. And the last one is quite new, connectivity. So there's a new focus on mostly physical infrastructures to counter the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But here again, I mean, this is a European idea, but we will never be able to match the kind of funding that China is able to provide to its immediate neighborhood, right? So for us, the Indo-Pacific is really too far away. And so the connectivity issue is important, but it will happen probably in conjunction with America and regional allies, right? So you can't expect, say, a big European footprint there. All right, so I'll skip this part, but remember this term, hybridity, okay? So the EU is sort of torn between supranational and intergovernmental elements, right? The Council is the representation of member states' governments, while the Commission, and I'd say the European Parliament as well, represent the European interest. Yeah? And of course, then you have quite a few, say, tensions between these institutions. The Council and the Commission both serve as the executive in Europe, right? And it's very different from what nation states would do, right? And this is really because in some areas, right, take the pillar on the left, if you look at the European treaties, some policy areas are fully supranationalized, right? So it's the European Commission that makes the laws, right, and the regulations, while in common foreign and security policy and also in other matters like police and criminal and judicial cooperation, of course, then you have more of an intergovernmental footprint, right? There it is the member states that are important, and this is really a grand bargain, right, between member states. Right? As soon as member states decide to move a certain policy area up to the supranational level, right, it will then be absorbed by the EU and move to the left pillar. Right? But right now, when we're talking about foreign and security policy, right, we're still here in the middle, and the middle is really intergovernmental. Right? So what I'm trying to say here is that in defense, right, these are different modes of EU policymaking. The EU has different, say, instruments, right, to help member states bring about a certain, say, goal, right? And it's usually things like enhancement and facilitation and coordination in those areas that the EU doesn't have an exclusive competency. Right? So the first policy mode here, community method, would be full-blown supranationalism. Right? So the member states here really don't play much of a role. It's like in trade, in say the common market, but also in foreign trade relations, you have a very strong role of the EU Commission. And this is because it has exclusive competency over trade. But then, of course, in other areas, take defense, right? You don't have an EU Commission footprint. And this is because member states are in power. And this would be then the last one here on the spectrum, intensive transgovernmentalism or policy coordination. So member states still meet, under the umbrella of the EU, right, to coordinate policies. This happens all the time in all kinds of policy areas, right? But the EU is really just an onlooker or a facilitator, right? It provides infrastructure and a room. Sometimes it provides funding or regulation to help member states coordinate. Right? So this is the idea. So this is why this explains the spectrum of different policy modes. And in defense, we can see a push or say a movement from intensive transgovernmentalism to policy coordination and even some elements of distribution. Right? Distribution means the EU helps fund some defense initiatives, like through the European Defense Fund, which was which has been strengthened in 2017 as part of the comprehensive defense package in the EU. So that's distribution, but then of course we have more policy coordination. Take PESCO, right? The PESCO, there has been a lot of media attention lavished on it over the past year, but PESCO really is policy coordination. It's not the EU taking the mantle of defense away from the member states. Right? Okay, here just remember, we're still talking about NATO and not about the EU when we talk about defense. Right? And this is important because America, after the Trump administration, now with the Biden administration, is sort of reinvigorating the alliance. And of course, it is trying to help the alliance pivot to Asia as well. Right? So we can sort of say this new Dutch, German, French, the guidelines and the strategies towards the Indo-Pacific, of course, they're all part of a larger debate within the Atlantic Alliance, within NATO. So I would say, I would venture this argument, and would say it would see a stronger NATO footprint in Asia. And this is because the defense capabilities work best in that framework, but will not see an EU defense footprint in the Indo-Pacific. This creates all kinds of new problems, of course, because NATO and the EU are two separate organizations. Right? And the EU, of course, it has done a lot over the past few years, say the past 10 years or so, to improve European defense. And I think the symbol here would be the EU brigades, right? This European Union battalion-sized battle groups, as they're called, EUBG. And that's very interesting. It's the battalion size. In theory, you can project them around the world, right? And they can stay in theater for, I think, 2 years or so. So it's very ambitious and it's a very interesting, say, policy instrument, but it has never been used because member states can't agree on where to send the battle group and how, and under which conditions. Right. So this is, I think, the basic conundrum of the EU. So even if you create new instruments, right, because the capabilities are still member state owned, right, it's not the Commission that can do anything about that, right? So if it's member states sending troops abroad and not the Commission, despite having new frameworks that are quite interesting, right? The battle groups are under the Council, right? And so they have a very strong, say, European connection, right? So this is not just national capabilities under the European umbrella. It's more than that, right? But it's still member states, governments who send the soldiers into harm's way. Right? And this is part of this, the comprehensive defense package. This will be my last slide. So the European Defense Fund and then Coordinated Annual Review on Defense called CARD, and PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation in Defense Matters. This was really a paradigm shift in 2017, right? And it was quite ambitious. A lot of European funds are now sort of ready to be invested in that area. But again, this is sort of incremental change. This is tweaking the institutional structure, but the basic tension between member states and the EU Commission remains. Right. Okay, so this means the European defense will continue to be a messy affair, mixing supranational, intergovernmental, and national elements. The EU's role will remain that of an enabler, enhancer, coordinator, and facilitator. Okay, and this is why I'd say we won't see more European power, but really more Europe. Right? Yeah, and this is because capabilities lie on the wrong level of governments, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this tour de force through European policy making and also the capabilities on lack of capabilities of the European Union. There's quite a lot to untangle there. I was actually quite struck by you remarked just as a little footnote that PESCO is actually part of policy, is actually a policy coordination, much rather than the European Union taking charge. This is very interesting because here in this region, I observed that, and probably not only in this region, that EU diplomats tend to pretty much at every given possibility, whenever they have a microphone in front of them, to assert that PESCO is actually the EU taking charge. They may not say it directly like that, but they always imply that with PESCO, the European Union now has a military capability, right? Which is, as I understand, from your presentation now not exactly the case, right? So it's still all the member states deciding, and the European Union just basically playing a facilitator here, which I find quite an interesting point to highlight here, in particular because it is mentioned so often here, right? So we always hear from the diplomats the Atalanta and PESCO. This is always cited here in this region all the time when we are critically investigating European Union contribution to security in general here in this region. I find that very interesting. Also, that the EU brigades, brigades are as of yet unused. Quite interesting. Before you perhaps can say a few words about PESCO, if you want to comment on what I've just said, I have something that I really want to ask you about the Geopolitical Commission, right? If it is so obvious that EU capabilities are limited, and if it is indeed, as you say, inbuilt in the treaties and in the institutional setup that there is this lack of capabilities, then why would you, as EU bureaucrats, decide to call this a geopolitical commission, obviously being aware of the limitations and the problems that that this entails, right? So what you do is you create massive demands or massive expectations upon which you will not be able to deliver. So now, before I hand over back to you, I would like to highlight that here in this region, in ASEAN, we see this quite often, right? That ASEAN agrees on sort of lofty objectives, which will probably never be met. The difference is perhaps, from the way I see ASEAN and the European Union, that ASEAN never really intends to meet those goals in the first place, and nobody really expects them to meet those goals, right? It is just a matter of fact that they like to agree on stuff to move forward in other areas, perhaps, right? So this massive expectations that ASEAN sometimes raises here in this region with their documents and policy papers is not, by ASEAN observers at least, not really critically questioned, because nobody really expects them to deliver on those anyway, because they fulfill a different diplomatic function. Whereas in the European Union, this would be quite unusual, right? That you raise these kind of expectations simply for the sake of having them out there and for the sake of public diplomacy, right? So the European Union is much more functional than this generally, from my experience. So please untangle this conundrum for us. Why naming it a geopolitical commission, knowing that the lack of capabilities would probably never really allow the European Commission to take charge in this area?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Of course, it's a huge topic. The von der Leyen Commission was criticized by some parts of the think tank world and of academia for raising this kind of expectations, because it was clear from the beginning that structurally the EU would not be able to deliver. But having said that, symbolism does matter, and this is what the Delors Commission in the 1980s did. Basically, it said, well, Eurosclerosis, or say European integration fatigue, we don't care, right? We need to sort of untangle this, right? We need to cut through all these problems, and we'll do this by creating a very ambitious regulation package. And this will then sort of over time, at least, sort of change. Yeah, it will not, maybe not jumpstart European integration, but it will sort of overcome the fatigue, right? And this is really what happened. And this couldn't have worked without the symbolism. Right? So this is, I think, what von der Leyen was trying to do. So to give this new Europe a face, right? Even though I think it was quite clear, even to the Commission itself, right, that this wouldn't happen overnight. And then, of course, COVID-19 struck, right? And so we must not forget this, that the Commission, I think, hoped that on the home front, everything would be fine, right? Because of the defense package, right? So there was new momentum, right, for integration in a very, say, sensitive policy area. And then it could sort of focus, right, on the geopolitics of this, say, defense integration and this new ambition in foreign policy. But I think that was the hope. But then, of course, it got distracted and sidetracked, right? Because it had to deal with the crisis at home, and this is why it looks so disappointing today. It might not have been that bad, right? Otherwise, right? But I'm just explaining this to observers who don't live in this region, right? And so we also have this problem that, in some policy areas, it's really about the declarations to help nudge member states in a certain direction, right? And then over time, you know, through a culture of cooperation and also through socialization that happens in these institutions, right? We can see, and this is basically the spillover, the neo-functional argument, right? You say that we have more cooperation in one area, and this will lead to more consensus, more harmonization in other areas, right? Like defense. That was the big hope, that we could build on the 2017 defense package. And this brings me to PESCO really quickly. The PESCO is, I mean, it's tremendously important because it is a paradigm shift in European defense, right? Now we have a stronger, much stronger European footprint within Europe, right? When it comes to increasing readiness and increasing capability. So that's the idea. But, you know, the step from that sort of infrastructure argument at home towards the power projection argument abroad, that is, I think, a big leap. Then we haven't still been able to take it.
Okay, Christian, thank you very much. So there are quite a large number of questions here coming in the Q&A function. So I guess we tackle them one by one, and I will also see if I can if I can sort of arrange them somehow by topic. There's a question from Shona. She's one of our students, and she's here with MINDEF. She works at the Ministry of Defense here in Singapore, and she's also one of our part-time students. She is highlighting the discrepancy again between turn and pivot. What exactly did you mean by turn versus pivot? Right. I think this is something you can just highlight once again. Very briefly. Then I would like to read out a question from Alan Chong. He is the head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS. Prof. Chong is asking, Christian, you mentioned that the tensions are somewhat mitigated between supranationalism, i.e. the Commission, and intergovernmentalism, the Council in this case, in the person of the EU Foreign Minister, currently served by a veteran Spanish diplomat. Do you feel nonetheless that the geopolitical mindset of France and Germany are the dominant foundations for any EU foreign policy, or is there some foreign policy making by referendum taking place among the 27 member states? Okay, before I hand back to you, I would like to apologize for this terrible sound here in the background. This is a thunderstorm / rain that you only get in Singapore.
All right, thank you for the question. Let me pick them up one by one. A turn versus pivot. What I meant is that we'll see more European attention lavished on the Asia Pacific, right, or on the Indo-Pacific. So this means more, but mostly more soft power initiatives, right? This is what I'm trying to say. So connectivity, more cooperation. It could be security dialogue or security cooperation, right? But it's mostly, or I'd say exclusively, soft power oriented. That's the Pacific turn, and it's a big change to before because we didn't think about Asia, the Indo-Pacific as strategically as we're trying to do now. So that's a big change. But it's not a pivot to Asia because we're not be able to send hard power instruments into that region, at least not from Europe, right? So it's European EU level hard power capabilities, right? Because they don't exist, right? So you will see here and there more hard power by European member states, but this is not a full-blown pivot when we talk about Europe as a whole. All right, so then foreign policy, Germany and France. Yes, these two countries are the most important member states in the EU, and it's true that their, say, strategic cultures influence or inform European foreign relations, right? It's a foreign policy plus for security policy and defense. So that is true, but that's only true for very sensitive decisions that are taken, right? The more sensitive a decision is, the more the national interests sort of take over, right? So if the French president, right, and the presidential system tends towards grand gestures, right? If the French president decides that the French, say, footprint in the Indo-Pacific should be increased, right? And then, of course, this will sort of create, a change of movement within the EU, right? And it will also sort of convince the EU level to sort of try to complement this somehow. That is true. But in the day-to-day decisions, and these are, say, the 95% of all the decisions taken in foreign relations, you have something like foreign policy by consensus, and that's organized in the council. Yeah, and I'd say similar to the UN, everybody talks about, and the UN Security Council, everybody talks about the sensitive decisions, but these are really 3 to 5% of everything else that's going on there. And in the rest of the time, it usually works relatively well. And here we can see that there is really this socialization argument at work, that EU member states, that the longer they're in the EU, the more they harmonize their outlook, the geopolitical outlook, and their understanding of foreign relations at home as well. So that's quite interesting. So it's really foreign policy by consensus. But of course, you need to think about instruments, right? So when you think about power projection, or who does what abroad, who can actually do anything abroad, then it really comes down to maybe 3 or 4 important member states.
Thank you, Christian. That also reminds me of the person, to what extent the person of the High Representative plays a role. And I remember that his predecessor, Federica Mogherini, she had quite a personal interest in Asia, and I remember that the European and tried to initiate Asia. So perhaps it's slightly dependent on the person as well, right? Because it seems to me that Josep Borrell has slightly less of an interest in Asia, but he's relatively new in office, and then, as you said, COVID happened. So I guess we will see. I apologize once again for the thunderstorms. This is really obviously out of my hands. This is again one of those terrible rains and thunderstorms you really only get in the tropics. Okay, so let's move on to questions. So if you can't hear me anymore, please let me know, and I will try to arrange something else. Yes.
Freddie, let me pick up what you've just said about personalities, and it gives you some time to take care of the thunderstorm. It's personalities do matter. That's absolutely correct. And Federica Mogherini, so the predecessor of Josep Borrell, an Italian diplomat that was virtually unknown in Europe, where before she became foreign minister in the EU. It's another interesting case because many said, well, how can she be so inexperienced, right? Shouldn't this be a person like Javier Solana, the Spaniard who was her predecessor, so the first Mr. Gasp? Shouldn't she be, say, more powerful because he would have more institutional experience, but also be better known? Maybe Javier Solana used to be a foreign minister himself. He was not just a diplomat. So all of this would give him, say, political power and the power to bring people together. And of course, this is a big discussion. And Josep was a big discussion for Federica Mogherini, but then after a while, people saw that, what Europe actually does best is this nitty-gritty day-to-day work, right? And she gave European foreign policy direction, guidance, the strategy, the global strategy, right, happened under her auspices as well, right? So you can see that these small steps matters too, but it comes in waves, right? So you need, say, a very powerful, ambitious a foreign minister, but the next one should be more focused on the day-to-day, on the technocratic side of it, right? To give Europe and the European member states the chance to accept a new foreign minister that again is very ambitious.
Okay, thank you. So we have several questions here from the audience. One is about your remarks that the EU has described China as a partner, competitor, and rival, which is quite similar to what the United States is currently proposing. The question is here really about possibilities for synergizing a transatlantic approach towards China. So, what are really the prospects for coordination between the member states and the new administration in the United States towards China?
Yeah, that's of course an important question. What we can say, that's the good news, is now with Trump gone, right, there's new space for transatlantic coordination in that sense. And I think what happened, and I think this might be a good thing that came out of the Trump administration, is that Europeans, for the first time really since the end of the Second World War, felt left alone by America. And this has really helped jumpstart European defense. As I said, I mean, on the capability side, it wasn't that successful yet, right? But on the infrastructure side, and that's what the EU can do best, actually a lot happened. And this is really a direct reaction to the Trump administration that tried to downplay NATO and played with canceling the alliance altogether. So this was one thing. So it created a new idea of strategic autonomy within Europe, right? And now we see, well, the Biden administration sort of coming back into the fold, right? And then this means that Europe will now the Europeans are now looking for new theaters or arenas where they can deploy these new capabilities. And I think there, of course, to make the alliance work, right, now America can actually ask more of Europe in the Indo-Pacific, right? Because the pivot to Asia was really a purely American debate, right? It happened mostly outside of NATO. And now I think this debate is going to come back into NATO. And I think this is where the big shift will then happen. Right? But that's, of course, it's in conjunction with the EU, right? But sometimes also in competition with the EU, because the EU will continue to suffer from these competing priorities, right? So it's Russia and Africa versus Asia and the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. We have a very interesting question here about the current Myanmar crisis, which is something that is really here in this region, has really kind of taken over even from COVID, from our concern about COVID, right? This has really thrown a curveball here really at politics and international relations here in Southeast Asia, I would say. The question, the universe wants to sabotage me, that's clear. So we have a question here from Ha, from RSIS here in Singapore, and she's asking whether the current Myanmar crisis really is gonna affect the EU's turn to the Pacific, and more specifically when it comes to strengthening the relations with ASEAN, which is something the EU and also individual member states of the European Union have consistently stated they would seek, and they would try to place ASEAN at the center of their strategies here for engagement in the wider Indo-Pacific, which makes sense, of course, both being regional organizations. So to what extent will this Myanmar crisis, if you can comment on this at all, impact this? So I guess that's a normative question really to this issue.
Yeah, it's a hard one too. I would say, from what I've heard and from what I've read here in Europe, is that it's seen, the Myanmar crisis is seen as a primarily ASEAN problem, right? So the main responsibility for dealing with the Myanmar crisis is seen to be lying with ASEAN governments. And I think, I mean, there's good reasons for this, right? Because ASEAN can try to, if ASEAN is able to deal with the crisis in a positive way, right? So say de-escalate, maybe even, I don't know, help a democratic transition or something like that. That's quite ambitious. But if that happens, so if ASEAN is able to renegotiate its non-intervention principle, right, then I would say this will be a game changer in Europe for how Europe sees ASEAN. And I'd say ASEAN should be interested in this because in development policy, we call this principle more for more, right? The more effective you become as an organization, right, the more support you will get from, in this case, European member states and also from the EU. So that doesn't mean the EU wants to solve the crisis on its own, right? Or wants to solve it through ASEAN. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that ASEAN should have an enlightened self-interest to try to take care of this. And this will then improve relations to the EU even more. It's what's happening in Myanmar is really disappointing, and it's really tragic because the EU was hoping, and European member states also was hoping, that Myanmar could become, say, a new beacon of democracy in the region, right? I mean, of course, with its problems, right, there's still a transition that would have taken a long time, right? And it's going to be a defective democracy for a long time also, but the idea was that this could become, say, a new case study, right, for positive reform and democratic transition. And now, of course, these hopes have been dashed. Yeah, that's as much as I can say on Myanmar.
Okay, so I guess this for us here in the region, I think most of us at least always look towards these hopes with a bit of skepticism. I guess the hopes that Myanmar would become a fully fledged democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi would become the sort of torchbearer for pro-democracy movement come government was always perhaps a bit naive. I guess it's kind of sinking in now, but I would agree with you, of course, that this is it's such a sad story. It's really throwing us a curveball here right now, and this is not only of course suffering, but also for ASEAN. It's really difficult for ASEAN to deal with this, and I'm a bit skeptical about this non-interference nudge you just gave there. But it is worth bearing in mind that the European Union is de facto by far the greatest contributor to the ASEAN integration project in monetary terms, contributing significantly more than the member states themselves. So there is some sort of vested interest on ASEAN's part in engaging with the European Union. Okay, so there's a follow-up question right here. So on Myanmar, what the question here really is, what would happen if ASEAN completely fails, right? If ASEAN falls, not if ASEAN falls, but if ASEAN falls on the Myanmar question, right? So from a European perspective, neglects its duties with regards to Myanmar and does not affect any sort of change in Myanmar. So how would you think would this impact relations with ASEAN?
Yes, thank you for this question. I would say it will not change anything. Because the strategic relationship is still going to be seen as being fundamental to the European, say, relations to the Indo-Pacific, right? So it's still going to be seen as the core, right? So you said if ASEAN fails, right? But that's of course not in the cards, right? ASEAN as a regional organization will continue what it does, and the non-intervention principle, of course, I understand this, has been fundamental, right, to ASEAN. This is the main reason why it still exists and why it could sort of expand even, right? So I'd say there's a lot of good arguments for it, and the EU will not change the strategic relationship with ASEAN. I think no, this is not in the cards. This would only change if the majority of ASEAN member states would turn authoritarian, say. Right? But that's also not likely, and it also doesn't change the geopolitical equation that the EU is seeing playing out in the region, right? So it's still about hedging against China. It's still about deterring China. So with Japan and Australia, it's more deterrence. With ASEAN, it's more hedging or balancing China. So now, and this also doesn't change.
Thank you. We have a question here from Dr. Joe Lang. He is a colleague of mine at RSIS at the Center for Multilateralism Studies, and he is highlighting how tricky the history is between Europe and Asia and Asian engagement, and how little effect previous efforts at developmental assistance and so forth had. So the question we are asking here really in this region, and Joel is articulating here, is what can Europe really qualitatively offer on the foreign and security policy front? Perhaps you mentioned it a bit in your presentation. You mentioned that the EU does have trade competence, right? So that's perhaps something where they can work. He's also highlighting that it could be interpreted as confrontation with China, which is certainly not what Southeast Asia wants to see here. Is the EU's return a strategic move still in search of a firm rationale? Is his final remark. So what can Europe really offer Asia, and to what end?
So as far as I understood, this question regards the EU level, right? Really just the union, not so much the individual member states. And here I would say two things. Firstly, we can look at all the policy areas where the EU level has exclusive competency. And the most important here is trade or foreign trade relations, right? And the EU has just signed a free trade agreement with Japan, right? And this will go on, right? So there's going to be a push towards more free trade between Europe and Asia, in inverted commas. So I think that this one thing. But of course, if you look at all the other policy areas, right? And when we talk about security, of course, you could either say, well, the EU doesn't play a role. And I think that's also not true, because the EU, even though it doesn't have capabilities of its own, it provides the forum for member state coordination. Right? So, and we must not underestimate the power of the EU behind closed doors in these negotiations. Right? It's really so this the EU always has an agenda of its own, right? And it always sort of tries to nudge and push member states in a certain direction. And the results of coordination, right, could be a more concerted or joint effort by member states, right, to increase the defense footprint in the region or the development policy footprint in the region. And so I think this is also, it has a European element to it. So help me with the second part of the question.
Yeah, no, I think you answered it perfectly. Yeah, I think you answered it perfectly. There's a question, Christian, you and I personally, we discussed quite a bit in previous bilateral interactions we had, the Quad, and so I know you're a great expert on the Quad. So here's a question about it. How is the revived Quad cooperation going to play out along the new European Indo-Pacific initiative? This question comes from retired diplomat Dr. Annemarie Schleich, and I guess it's pointing towards the position of the EU on the Quad and to what extent they are interested in engaging with this mechanism or not.
First, let me say I'm not an expert on the Quad. Right? I think you're more of an expert on the Quad than I am. What I'm trying to say here is that I think the jury is still out on the Quad. So in Brussels, there's two camps, right? Like in any other, say, national capital in Europe. One camp is more optimistic and says, all right, so this is the beginning of a broader integration. It starts in defense, but could include other policy areas between these four countries. And then over time, maybe we can have something like a Quad plus, right? So we can sort of open up the membership base. This would be one camp, and I think it's very optimistic. It's and I would call it the neo-functional group. And the other camp sees it as, and I think Frederic, you're part of that group, sees it very, is more realistic about this and says, well, the Quad, what keeps the Quad together is, the China threat, in inverted commas, or the China challenge. And so, the Quad should focus on this. It should not become an alliance. It should not become a Southeast Asian NATO, right? Or an East Asian NATO. And I think that the jury there is still out, so we don't know where it's going to go. I'd say right now it's a very pragmatic, hyper-pragmatic cooperation, right? Bounded together by the China challenge. I totally agree there. But again, I would say, well, it has the potential to grow into something else. But the question is, will it compete with other regional organizations or not? And I think for the EU, this will be the thing to look at, the indicator to look at, right? So will it find, will it become an organization, right? Will it create a secretariat? Will it become, say, a more structured form of defense cooperation or not? That's the first thing, institutionalization. And the second one is, what about inter-organizational relations, right? So will it sort of create constructive relationships with the organizations that are already there? And then it could find its own niche in the region.
Thank you, Christian. Here's a question on the Asia-Europe Foundation activities, headquartered here in Singapore, by the way. This, of course, is something that emerged out of the ASEM process, right, between Asia and Europe. And Ellen Chong is asking is noticing that you did not refer to the Asia-Europe Foundation or to ASEM at all. And he is wondering why this is the case. Is this functional intent at an early Pacific turn now becoming irrelevant, or is there still some relevancy in this? What do you think, Christian?
Well, it will remain relevant, of course. I didn't talk about it because I was focusing more on defense, right? And on the capabilities issue. But no, of course, this is ASEM and ASEF. They're both part of the soft power engagement of Europe in the region. Now, that is absolutely true, and it will continue. It will never fade away. And it's been explicitly stated in the German Indo-Pacific guidelines that funding should go on, and it will also find a place or find its way into the European strategy. That's absolutely clear. But again, there's a certain, say, frustration with ASEM because, of course, when this whole process was initiated, there was a lot of, say, ambition and a lot of hope that this would sort of create, at least on the people-to-people basis, right, much more interaction between those two regions. But again, back then I thought it's also a bit naive. I mean, those two regions are really far away. Right. So again, the symbolism I think here is very important, and it will continue to be important. But we can't expect the ASEM process to fundamentally change the relationship between Europe and Asia. Right. And there's a geographic argument here too. The immediate threat for the immediate challenge for the EU is and will continue to be an assertive Russia. It will only change if Russia really democratizes. Right? Then sort of Europe can find other priorities. And this is why ASEM, it will never go away, right? But it will remain under potential.
I remember once a Thai diplomat telling me that the ASEM process is kind of useless because you only get 1 minute to speak, and that's pretty much it. So I thought that was quite, of course, because of the broad membership. So that was quite a functional criticism of the ASEM process as such. But I agree with you with that it's an area of soft power and perhaps also something where the Track 2 area in general is quite useful and finds quite prominent mentioning actually in the German Indo-Pacific paper. So it'd be interesting to see how much of this support for think tanks and European think tanks that operate here in this region will actually be part of the European Union strategy in the end. Okay, Christian, we're almost out of time, but I can't really. You being based there are you in Berlin or Potsdam now? Right? I'm not quite sure. I think you're in Berlin. So I really can't let you go without a reference to the post Angela Merkel era, right? So I mean, this is something that is really coming up very soon, right? So Angela Merkel, it feels like, has been with us for a lifetime, for better or for worse, in Germany, and she has certainly a great reputation. She's probably got even a better reputation abroad than she has at home, and at home her reputation is already pretty good for such a long chancellor. So she's always seen here everywhere in the world really as the de facto leadership figure, right, in Europe. And this, of course, is part her seniority, part her character, and her remarkable way to be calm and composed and policy oriented. So the question really here is, we all know that there is no future for Merkel other than retirement. And what is going to happen? I mean, who is going to take over this role? Or is this even necessary to take over this role, especially in terms of foreign policy and geopolitics? Macron is obviously an obvious successor to that kind of role. He's already in the mix, but he's facing re-election soon. So who knows how that is going to go? I believe next year. We now have Mario Draghi in Italy, but Italy changes their governments usually every 6 months or so. So who knows? So what is your best guess?
Another $1 million question. Well, yes, Merkel is seen abroad, but also within Europe as being sort of Madame Europe in many ways. And The Economist calls her that all the time. And that's because she's been in power for longer than anyone else in Europe. That's quite interesting, bar Putin. Right, but within the EU, it's really her, and you see that it's important to have, say, long-lasting chancellorships because it brings a certain level of stability to the European negotiation processes. Right? And this is the reason why Italy is so unimportant within the EU. It's really because of the lack of political stability, right? It can't follow up on agendas because they change all the time. So this is why it's important to have Germany as being the arch stabilizer of the EU on the member state level. But having said that, independently of who succeeds Merkel, we will see that there will be a new space for the EU Commission. Okay, so once you get rid of this sort of this mother figure, right? Well, she towers above everyone else in Europe. I think this will improve the standing of the Commission, and not necessarily von der Leyen herself as the Commission president, but the Commission will have more space to sort of nudge politically member states in a certain direction. So I think that's on the EU level is quite important. On the Germany level, on the national level in Germany, I'd say in foreign policy, so foreign and security policy, there will not be that much change. Right, and this is because of the coalitionary nature of German governments. It's really, that's because everybody sort of, it feels like everybody's in power all the time, right? So we have something like a permanent grand coalition, but this of course means that in foreign relations you have a lot of stability because the changes are not so marked, because everybody is sort of invested in the status quo, right? And even if, and that's I think a big if, we get a green chancellor, this would be a paradigm shift for German policy, right? But there's a possibility this could happen. Even then, I'd say if we look at what kind of people then would become chancellor, they are the most moderate ones in that otherwise relatively radical party in foreign policy. So I'd say we'll not see that much change. But again, right, the coalitionary nature of the governments in Germany mean that this is a system that tends towards minimal consensuses, right? So we'll also not see an improvement, right, of the German footprint anywhere in the world, right? It'll be the status quo all over again. And this is frustrating to all of us who argue for a more activist and more effective foreign and defense policy in the world.
Christian, thank you very much. Just allow me one follow-up question, please, that just came up from your answer. I'm not sure if I entirely got you right. So your prediction or your sense is that with a departure, inevitable imminent departure of Angela Merkel, there will be more space for the EU Commission. So if this is the case, is it perhaps true that there will be a new, not per treaty, of course, but de facto a new power alignment between maybe a slight power shift between the Council and the Commission? Is that am I correct in paraphrasing you that way, or is that not correct?
Yeah, this is exactly what I meant, and you said it much better than I did. The power balance between these two organizations will change, right? And that's because personalities matter on both levels.
Fantastic. Thanks for that clarification. Christian, great stuff. As always, I feel there's so much stuff to discuss. We probably need you on again at some point. Sorry about that, but we probably have to have you on again. There's so much to go through. So let us all look forward to the European Union strategy on the Indo-Pacific, and then we will see. I hope we will not all be disappointed, but who knows? Okay, with this, I leave you all into the weekend. Christian, I wish you a very fantastic Friday. It's morning where you are, so please be productive. Everyone here in Singapore, please enjoy your weekend, and join me virtually in thanking Professor Christian Rieck for taking the time this morning, which is a very, very busy morning for him, to speak to us and illuminate us a bit more on European foreign policy making and the prospects for the Pacific. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in to our RSIS webinar today. Please stay alert for other webinars in that space in this area, and also for our commentaries and policy reports, where we will also in the future very likely tackle the European Union Asia policy a lot more than we have done in the past, simply because of ongoing developments in Europe that really point into that direction. So thank you very much for joining me, and I wish you a fantastic evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.